Shalom, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of our 1 Timothy series. So this will be fun, and when we kind of start getting into it, as Paul really gets into it, I want to make our last episode a little shorter so we could devote the time to really going over as much of this material as we can. And while that will be impossible to some degree, especially with the audience of who these people are, we'll be covering that in a later episode. And the reason for that is because when we're reading any letter or any piece of literature, especially something like this by Paul, we have to take almost the whole book and analyze it against itself. A lot of times plots or identities or things like this will be revealed at the end of a piece of literature, and it'll make things start to make sense. It's kind of like that surprise at the end of the movie where the whole movie starts to make sense. And I guess it wouldn't be too different here in Paul. So I don't want to jump to anything, but what we will be doing is we'll be spending a bit of a technical approach in these first couple episodes, kind of going over, or probably most of it, just going over these terms that we find. So chapter 1 is setting up the whole book. And since the pastoral epistles are usually grouped together, or at least 1 and 2 Timothy are supposed to be grouped together, as we have no indication that the environment changed. And so whatever we understand from 1 Timothy, we can apply to 2 Timothy. A little bit different with Titus, since the geographical and therefore the cultural location is entirely different. It basically helps us to begin reading once we can kind of establish what's being said. So obviously chapter 1 is going to define the rest of the book. However, we see that in chapter 1, Paul starts identifying these opponents of his, warning Timothy about this, giving him a charge to stop these things. And then immediately in chapter 2, he switches to the church structure. And then he'll eventually get back to the opponents, and then back to church structure, and then back to general instruction, particularly towards Timothy individually. So in that spirit, we will go over chapter 1, and then we'll jump into chapter 2 and continue on. And then we'll come back to chapter 1 to some extent. Now, typically, I discourage people from doing major word studies, basically. I've discussed this to some extent, Bible study, that, it gets a little dangerous when people know a little bit of Greek and they start really hyper-focusing on like what these words mean. And people think it's sufficient to go to Strong's or Blue Letter Bible. And while that has its place, and word studies and semantics are obviously important, oftentimes, as I've said numerous times, in translation, you're interpreting a sentence, and then on a larger scale, a paragraph, and then a whole letter or book or section, etc. But this is somewhat exception, because what we have in this first letter is we have a bunch of terms that do need to be defined to some degree. And this has its place in any piece of literature, but here we're trying to come up with a really specific identity for who Paul is speaking to. So, with that being said, we're going to just kind of get right into it. So, here we beginning in chapter 1, obviously, verse 4, nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies which promote speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. And certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion. So these people are, from verse 3, they're the heterodidascaline. They're teaching contrary, teaching different doctrine to what Paul and Timothy are teaching. The orthodox and accepted things. So, verse 4 begins with mede prosekin, which we would understand as neither nor for mede, and give heed to, give oneself to, care for, or of, follow, or devote, for prosekin. So these people are not, or they're to be charged to not teach differently, nor, so including both, to basically give themselves over to these myths and endless genealogies. And this meta is interesting because it's not just that they're teaching different to doctrine, they are also, devoting themselves to these myths and endless genealogies. So obviously these are two words of particular interest here. The first is mythos, and for myths, and it's a tale, story, fable, or legend. Oftentimes we think first of myths, as in legends like Greek mythology in this instance, but it's often used in simply a falsehood sense or a contrast, like contrary to the truth sense. So BDAG, the premier Greek lexicon, it adds to this historians' concern for the truth of history as opposed to mythography, quote unquote. And it's typically used of fiction versus the truth. It's used of myths such as by Plato concerning myths in Hades, but also by Plutarch of being useless fabrications, with both Philo and Josephus, who were Jews, considering them as errors. Philo, specifically in De Congresso 53, calls them mistakes that follow from inconclusive arguments, as Wall and Steele put it in their commentary. And Collins has some notes on these too. And in Scripture, we find it used here in chapter 4, verse 7 of irreverent, silly myths, which we'll go into more detail there. And in 2 Timothy 4:4 of people turning away from the truth and wandering into myths, following the famous verse 3, when people will not endure sound doctrine, but accumulate for themselves teachers. And then also in Titus 1:14 of specifically Jewish myths. And finally, in 2 Peter 1:16 of the apostles having not followed, as the scripture says, cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Yeshua Messiah, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. So this really adds to mythos perhaps being best understood as a mixture of falsehoods and myths in our sense, but something that's just contrary to truth, as in lying, something made up. And then we have our two terms, which is genealogies and aparantos. So our word aparantos simply means endless, never-ending, and genealogies is, as we would expect, where our English genealogies come from. It's pretty straightforward. It's only used here and in Titus and 3:9 of avoiding foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law. Some believe the use of kai here, which and it connects these two, and that is as in the myths, which are the endless genealogies, but that's a typical argument, and I guess it can be made as endlessly, fruitlessly as these endless genealogies. So we don't really know, and that it seems for and usually and is kind of having two things that are separate. You have like the air and the water. And I guess the argument could be made for them to be connected, but it's anyone's game there. So the next word we have is zetesis, which is dispute, questions, controversies, investigation, debate, argument. And it's basically that of controversial questions or heated debate. It's used in 1 Timothy 6:4 of he who is, as it says, is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions. It's also used in 2 Timothy 2:23 of have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. That they breed quarrels. And then Titus 3:9, as earlier with mythos. And it's also used, so in John 3:25 of John the Baptist's disciples, they're disputing or discussing over purity. And then interestingly, Acts 25:20 of Festus asking Paul interrogative questions when he was in court. So it has this general, basically, disputeful questions, and it just doesn't create something sound and something true and something firm or absolute, if you would. And then, the word before that is parakusin, and that just means present or cause. It leads to and it creates these things. So he's saying avoid these, these myths, these basically untruthful things, these falsifications, and lists just never-ending genealogies, because all they do is they lead to just things that don't produce absolutes, just questions. And the next phrase is actually really interesting. Following these, we read malon et orkonomion theuten en piste in the Greek. And the first word is malon. It's really emphatic, rather. That's what it is. So it means like rather, but almost as in like a greater degree, superior to. And there's this deep contrast between what these false people are teaching versus what Paul and Timothy are, with some intensity and preferability of the latter. So it's these questions, these unanswered, void of absolutes, that are contrary to this term, which is really contested among people, and it's the orkonomion theo, and most translations render this as godly edification or instruction. And there's a minor textual variant here, but most people are still accepting of, oikonomion. So perhaps reading from BDAG would be best for this. For this word, they list three definitions as one, responsibility of management. So this would be functioning in a management sense. It's used like this in Luke 16:2-4, 1 Corinthians 9:17, Colossians 1:25, and Ephesians 3:2. Second is a state of being arranged, arrangement, order, plan, such as Ephesians 3. And then finally, they have a program of instruction or training. So you can kind of see where the translations are going with this. But what BDAG adds is they say, for the third option, this seems to fit best in 1 Timothy 1:4, where it said of the erroneous teachings of certain persons, they promote useless speculation rather than divine training that is in faith. However, they said if we follow option B, order or plan, it would be, and they propose a translation, endless speculative inquiry merely brings about contention instead of the realization of God's purpose, which has to do with faith. So it's difficult to choose which one we're going to go for. If we have management, which Paul does use this word, and this is why semantics are important, because you got to understand the pragmatics, you got to understand how this word is going to specifically be used. And, we have management, we have arrangement, and then we have program of instruction, training, but they seem to prefer something that's a little bit of a mixture, and it is difficult to choose which one. And this is something Knight wrestles with in his commentary. And it's really influenced, again, on the pragmatical nature of these passages. It's also influenced on, whether we read the didaskalin or didaskaloi words as instruction or doctrine, or different instruction or different doctrine. And these two do overlap in synonymity, so it's a bit tricky. But in his commentary, Knight proposes with some grammatical evidence that we should read it as, quote unquote, the outworking, administrative, or stewardship of God's plan of salvation through the gospel and its communication. And he adds, the heterodoxy of the false teachers' speculation is then contrary to the furthering of God's administration, which is brought about not by speculation, but in faith. With the definite article, Paul ties oikonomion with empiste, which is our word for in faith, and indicates the realm in which the administration is accomplished. That is en, or, our in for in faith. And he says, should not be taken as referring to initial saving faith only, but to the trust relationship that is the seedbed in which God works and produces growth, that this wider view of faith is in view, is seen by the fact that it is returned to in verse 5 as one of the means that Christians must use to bring about the goal of oikonomion and the attendant pargelia, which is this word for charge, namely agape. And end quote. So Knight's proposal, and that of others, is that this is basically God's plan, which we see and in which we experience by faith. God's overall administrative mission and plan, and this false, different teaching, getting into falsehoods and endless genealogies, is contrary to, rather than, the gospel. They're having people turn off from the gospel, and it leads to questions and speculations. But I haven't seen someone take the view I have, but I'm sure there wouldn't be any resistance to it, is that something that doesn't produce an absolute, an answer, is something we should think about with these disputations, or these questions. And in the spirit of this household management reference of sorts, I'd like to add an excerpt from Wall's commentary on page 81. And he begins this, I won't quote it all, but he speaks of how, in Hellenistic thought, as early as Aristotle, the efficiently managed household, whether political, and he quotes 1 Timothy 2:2, religious, 3:15, familial, 5:1 through 2, follows time-tested patterns. And he goes on how basically the household structure was so important in this day, and it certainly was in the Greco-Roman world, and even more so in the Jewish world. But he says the later reference to church as God's household in 3:15, and I'll interrupt him to add other areas such as Ephesians 2, suggests that the theou and oikonomion theou is a subjunctive genitive. That is, the creator is the manager of creation. In faith, then, affirms the believer's trust in God's providential care of the world. The reader now understands that the continuation of Paul's mission following his departure is a piece with God's overall management of the world. So I would prefer this rendering that I'm proposing, because basically what we see here is that they're false teaching with these myths and endless genealogies, and they promote speculations. This is all contrary to God's plan. So we kind of see it as the gospel. And this will help us in our interpretation of what these myths and genealogies even are, because for some reason they're going against this administrative plan of God. And this really is relevant when you think about what false teaching does. It's a lot less of what it is, and more about what it threatens to the gospel. The gospel is always at risk. It's not really at risk with its power, but it's at risk with what people can do to it for other people. So Paul continues. In verse 5, he says, the aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. So this charge, again, the word is pargelia, which is, just a word for charge, as we went over, kind of authoritative statement. And the word for aim is telos. Now, some translations, such as the King James, I believe, says, the end of the commandment. And this word telos really just means end goal, the point and direction of this. You can't really define telos as end, as in termination, and that has effect, obviously, on Romans 10:14. And you can't really say it's the goal either. It's kind of a combination of these two, and it's hard to translate such a thing. And telos in philosophy, has this whole worldview, end goal, like the whole substance of something, which something is leading to. So you're not just reading like, hey, this is the point of our charge, or the way in which our charge is going to go about. It's kind of like, this is the function, but the function that anticipates a goal to be reached, an active goal. And that's kind of what he's saying and it is love. It's agape, which the aim of our charge. And that issues from three things. He lists a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And this is interesting, and this is just kind of my thoughts, and some commentators note this as well, but I think there's a little bit of a theme here. So pure heart seems to be kind of a Hebraic expression, is heart, soul, mind, and strength were basically synonymous or But yeah, they're really just all one in the Hebraic mindset. And a pure heart is emphasized in Old Testament, Second Temple period literature, and just Judaism in general. So it's something Paul would be accustomed with. And this is kind of the Hebrew perspective. Now, a good conscience would definitely appeal to Greek and Hellenistic thought. It's also a deep concept within the New Testament to have a good conscience always, and conscience is always brought up. But it was very, very predominant in Greek culture, especially with the philosophers and in philosophy in general, of having a good conscience. So this could represent the Greek. And then finally, we have the sincere faith. And that's obviously of the faith, the true faith, and this holding on to Yeshua, having the faith faithfully delivered. And this is kind of like the Christian or the messianic aspect, or the follower of the way, whatever it is you want. And it's kind of all three of these meshing together, which is really cool. So reading on to verse 6, we have certain persons, by swerving from these. So obviously we're referring back to the pure heart, good conscience, and the sincere faith. They've wandered away into vain discussion. So our first word, for certain persons, tenest, it's the same. It's some, some people, some persons, certain people. And our next is astokesantes, and that this just simply means to miss the mark. By swerving from these, they've missed the mark. They've swerved from this. They haven't hit it, but in an avoiding sense. So it's used in 1 Timothy 6:21. Forgive me. Of avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge, for by professing it, some have swerved from the faith. And then 2 Timothy 2:16-18, but avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have swerved from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already happened. They are upsetting the faith of some. So seeing a little teaser, you're kind of seeing a little theme go if you're paying attention. But we'll get into that later. And then for turn aside, we have exetrapeson, which is turn aside, just go from and not follow, basically turn away from. You're going towards something, you turn off. Then we have ace, which is just a preposition denoting going into or towards, before, as in entering, or the anticipation of entering something in use or goal, etc. Finally, we have matelogion, and this is only here. It's a rare word of simply vain, idle, not truthful, false, pointless talking. BDAGs actually adds a windbag as an example, and we typically think vain and idle. We don't really make the connection there of what it really means. Obviously idle doesn't mean like standing still, and it obviously doesn't mean idle isn't a false god. It just means not truthful and just false, pointless, bad. And so these people, they're swerving from this charge, of love. They're missing this mark, of a good heart and conscience and faith. And they have exetrapeson, they're turning aside, they're going off, away, and wandering is a good word to render it. They're turning away into this false and idle, pointless, ridiculous talk and discussion. And moving on to verse 7, we have these are desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Our first is desiring. It's thelantes, and it means like eagerly desiring and determining to be. And it's typically translated would, as if they would be this. And it doesn't necessarily imply that they have or they haven't succeeded in the thing, but overwhelmingly used a desire to be or to do something, rather than more of a fixed position of actively being in it. Mounts actually opens up his definition in a good way, and he says, to exercise the will properly by an unimpassioned operation to be willing. So they desire to be. And what they desire to be is the nomo didaskaloi. And this is best meant as simply, teachers or lawyers of the law. It's compound of law and teacher. So an instructor. So it's used in Luke 5:17 and Acts 5:34. The first is Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. And the second of Gamaliel, who was a teacher of the law. So it's funny because you have a double negative here by Paul, basically saying they have no idea what they're talking about. And so they don't know what they're talking about at all. And then they don't understand what they say. We read here without understanding either what they are saying. So they don't know what they're saying. And they don't even know about the things from which they're making these confident assertions. It's a double negative of just not knowing. The confident assertions word is dia bebauntai, and it basically means strongly assert or insist. It's used in Titus 3:8 of Titus insisting on these things. It's a strong notion of affirming and confidence. They're confidently asserting these things, which ironically don't know what they're talking about, and they don't know anything about the things which they're trying to make these things that they're insisting on. And reading on to verse 8, Paul says, now we know the law is good if one uses it lawfully. And this is in this but now sense. We have a contrastive conjunction here, de. And it's typically used, explaining and negating what was said previously. Sometimes it's referring back to some other prior statement, reaching back. But most likely it's kind of Paul saying to Timothy, but we, Timothy, we know that the law is good, rather than these people desiring to be teachers. And it is good, that is, if one uses it lawfully. So the day is kind of interesting here. It's an interjection, you could say, to what was being said, which we see. And the word here for lawfully is, it's interesting. It's nominos, and it's basically a wordplay of nomos, which is the word for law. So it's like nomosly or lawfully. The word's only used once elsewhere in 2 Timothy 2:5 of an athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. So perhaps rightfully or properly is a good rendering, but here it's associated directly with the law. So it would obviously, we'd imagine it would be playing off the law for its specific meaning, which would be kind of like according to the law or lawly, and lawfully is not really a bad fit. So in his commentary, Collins adds to this in page 55, and he begins in an aside. So he's basically treating this in the following 2 passages as an aside to Paul's mainstream of rhetoric. So he's saying, these people desire to be teachers of law. And he says, but we know that it's good. He continues, the pastor offers a reflection on the law. He describes it as good, but with a proviso, that one lives in accordance with the law. And he notes some similarity with Paul's phrase here of to Josephus's Antiquities, book 16, section 2, block 3, saying the tense of the verb, a subjunctive, a present subjunctive, suggests a reference to future conduct along with some hesitancy as to whether one can actually live in full accord with the law. The apostle himself had affirmed that everyone has sinned, including those under the law. And he goes on to talk about Romans 1-2 and kind of the argument Paul was making against the Jews. He says they dared to teach others even as they themselves violate the precepts of the law and were prone to the same vices as the Gentiles were. So his mark to Josephus he's picking up something that this is implying someone keeping the law by keeping it lawfully. And he says it's really interesting that he's basically using this. Collins is somewhat suggesting that he's using this in the same sense, and I would suggest that this is possible. He's using what he's about to say is the same that he does in Romans 1-2. He's using this against the audience in the same way that he was to the Jews there. Obviously, I wouldn't suggest it's identical, but we'll kind of start picking up on this a little bit. And in verse 9, we keep reading. It says, understanding this. So basically like knowing this, as in we know this. Understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, and it continues into verse 10, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. So like we said, it's when he begins as saying, knowing this, and this is typical of Paul, used in the sense of adding on to something previously said or expounding upon a fact. He says the law is not laid down for the just. And I like when translations use this because often this word kemai is rendered made or something to that effect. However, it has a bit more of a nuanced meaning. BDAG lists as follows: to be in a recumbent position, lie or recline, to be in a place so as to be on something or lie. And it's used, as they say, in a variety of transferred senses involving especially abstractions: to exist, have place, or be there, be appointed, set, destined. They have some sub-meanings such as be, given, exist, or be valid of legal matters, which BDAG lists here for 1 Timothy 1:9, particularly for someone of law. Another sub-meaning of occur, appear, be found, find oneself to be. It's used in scripture of literal lying down, but also abstractly, as they're alluding to, like in Matthew 3:10, of the axe being laid to the trees, the roots. Matthew 5:14, of the city being set on a hill. 1 John 5:19, of the whole world lying in the power of evil one. 1 Thessalonians 3:3, of Paul and Timothy being destined for afflictions, etc. And with this, the meaning is still relatively obscure. Both all the words we established by its surrounding words, and basically it laid down is a much more appropriate rather than made. Paul had a choice amount of words to be able to use here, and he used something that seems a little more accusative, especially with this idea of the axe. It's almost like set down. The law's not set down, for the just. But for it's laid down for the lawless and the disobedient, the ungodly and sinners, unholy and profane. And a short note, and actually going on to verse 11, it says, in accordance with the gospel, it continues 10, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. So he has this list of these people, and he says, and then whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. Continuing in verse 11, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I had been entrusted. So a short note on this is there's obviously some speculation over what he uses for men who practice homosexuality. And the word here is arsenokoites. An interesting article on this is translate arsenokoitai 1 Corinthians 6:9, 1 Timothy 1:10, and it's by D.F. Wright, and it was published in the Visuale Christiane, and that's December 1987, volume 41, number 4, in pages 396 to 398. So it's a pretty short article, but he does a really good argument showing how this is speaking of homosexuality. And there's this issue, and a lot of times people try to twist and say, well, it's not really saying that, but it is. So there's actually an interesting kind of nature to this list, this vice list, we'll say. So if we read it in the Greek, and pay attention, we're going to read anomos de kai anuaptaktois asavesen kai hamar talois anosis ois kai bebelois patroluis kai metro ois andra phanois pornois arsena cortois andra pedistes sustes epiorkois. So if you listen, you hear all of those A's, those ahs. And granted, A is typically used in Greek to mark a negative. Earlier noted Collins actually notes this as a use of assonance, which is coupled with omitting conjunctions, and he writes that this enhances the force of their rhetoric. So basically, what he's saying is Paul is like rapid firing accusations against these people, and he's using all of these a words, a, and I'm inclined to agree with Collins here. And Paul then adds, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, and it's cool because this is our word for instruction, and doctrine, and it's used alongside with hugionousai, which is properly means healthy or sound, pure, etc. And it's commonly used by Greek philosophers for healthy teaching, and this is pretty accurate here. The sound doctrine is what this group false teaching is contrary to, and this vice list here, and it's in accordance. It's in relation with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God, which Paul had been entrusted with. And there's a lot going on here, really. Many jump immediately to see this list as just a compilation of sins and vices, vice list. So our conclusion is something like the law isn't for those who are saved, but for those people, enter vice descriptions. But that's not necessarily what this looks like. Words like kalos for good and kamai or for made, they're never associated with nomos except for Romans 7:16. So they're never, where it's the law is good. And this is an odd passage here, and we see little exposition we would expect for, say, a Jewish audience of someone just trying to teach people to keep the law. We find nothing of any type of keeping the law following this. We don't really see anything before it. We have no explicit language other than this idea that these people want to be teachers of the law. They're desiring, they're determined to be this. And we would just expect some type of clarification for that. Also, this list differs drastically from such ones as, Galatians 5:19 through 21. And this seems more accusatory. So, Collins, as we referred to earlier, and even Knight, as we do in most commentators, they're saying that this is from the Decalogue and also after, so not just the 10 words, because it's not the 10 commandments, it's the 10 words. There's an argument over if it's, 10 or 11 or 13 imperatives, do's. So, and mostly it's treated as 13 imperatives. But also, in Exodus 21 and 22. So I'm actually somewhat inclined to disagree with that. And I'll say why. So when we read the list, it's lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, and perjurers. So our first off, this is all kind of out of order. So when we read striking fathers and mothers, this is in Exodus 21:15. But then the enslavers, the slave trade is in Exodus 21:16, right after striking mothers and fathers. So it's kind of a bit off out of order. There's not much connection to, you can take the sexually immoral and you can attach it to adultery and then kind of play in with, the Sermon on the Mount. That's fine. And I'm not necessarily saying these people are wrong, but, we have 13 imperatives. Let's just say we have 10 commandments here. So for it to be the Decalogue, You have murder, which is obviously part of 10 words. You have not committing adultery. You have don't bear false witness. But you don't really have this ungodly, this unruly, the sinners, unholy, profane, striking fathers and mothers, general sexual immorality, homosexuality, enslavers, and perjury. You have it alluded to, but I think this is somewhat a weak connection. Now, looking at these words, the first one for lawless is just those without law. So typically anomia, just without law, not having law. Now we don't, this can be lawless in the literal sense, not as in the like the law breaking. It could just be lawless. It's used of Gentiles, not implying sinfulness. I mean, obviously everyone's sinful. Then we have after that disobedient, which is just really unruly people, like completely unruly. Third, we have ungodly, and then we have sinners. That's pretty evident. Then we have unholy, and then profane. We have striking fathers and mothers, murderers, sexually immoral, homosexuals, enslavers, liars, perjurers. And this final one, perjurers, is false witness. Both these are related to Exodus 23, 1 through 3 and 6 to 8. Interestingly, there are actually 13 terms here. So there could be some connection there. But here's why I think. It just, again, this list makes little sense connectively as some try to suggest. And what I'm suggesting, along with this argument of assonance that Paul's using, he's creating a theme. And let's notice it by splitting this into 7 groups. Group 1 is lawless and unruly. Group 2 is ungodly and sinners. Group 3 is unholy and profane. Group 4 is striking parents, murderers. Group 5 is sexually immoral, homosexuals. Group 6 is enslavers. Group 7 is liars and false witness. So we see these groups basically expounding upon each other as heightening what each one is. Listen, we have lawless, those without law, and unruly, just completely disobedient. Then we have those who are ungodly and sinners. And then we have unholy and profane, striking parents and murderers, sexually immoral and homosexuals, and enslavers and liars and false witness. The second one is an exaggeration and a worse condition of the first. So to be without law is not as bad as being just rebellious and disobedient and unruly. Ungodly is definitely not being like God, but sinners, and then unholy and then profane. And striking parents, you're hitting your parents, that's awful. And then murderers. And then you have sexually immoral homosexuals, like not even just being sexually immoral, but doing that out of nature's order. And then you have liars, which is obviously bad, but then you have false witness, someone who is giving a false account of someone else. That's obviously a much worse version. We could say all sin is sin, as that is true, but murder in your heart is not the same as murdering someone. Hitting your mom is bad, and don't do it. But murdering her is a little different. And this is what I think's going on here. I think Paul's really kind of enforcing this accusatory use here. And then what's group 6 for? Enslavers? Probably because the word starts with A. Andrapadistis. It's another A sound. There's another allusion possible here, and it's something we'll go over in a future episode, and it's speculative, but it will tie in here. What I'm saying is that I think there's a theme here, an accusatory one, and one that may, as we will see, fit these false teachers. Rather than this being a gloss of lawless versus righteous, or those prior to Messiah are now in him. The list is odd. It doesn't really fit Decalogue. Doesn't fit Exodus 20 to 22 conclusion. And nor does it fit one of these general doctrinal statements here that people are trying to present. When you first look at it, it does. But when you start breaking it down, it makes a lot less sense. And we'll start bringing in certain other aspects when we return to these passages later in the series, but it just makes less sense of what the mainstream interpretation is. And I'm just not prepared to do that. I don't believe what's actually at play here. And I think it's less than a sweeping general treatise of the law. I think it's something, and that requires a much longer and larger discussion. But it's using it purposefully here against these opponents, and I'm just not inclined to say Paul is using this generally for the law and its applicability. Perhaps we can read the law's not laid down for the laws, but it's this general disobedient, rebellious people with this compounding nature of who they are. And they've neglected faith, conscious pureness of heart. And it's really no easy passage, especially with kemai and for the word for made or laid down, having a particularly nuanced meaning in a sense. But it does make sense when you're applying it here. Now, the identity of the opponents will shed a great deal of light on our stalemate of sorts of exegesis here. Granted, I'm a messianic and may have interpretive bias, but when I look at the text, I just have hesitancy to interpret this the way everyone does. And there are generally two conclusions which people immediately come to when identifying the culprits here. Those are Judaizers and then Gnostics, and then a combination of both. We have to look at the attributes of these people to identify who they are. Whether we have Jews, Gnostics, something in between. And Judaizers are naturally assumed, particularly due to this, desiring to be teachers of the law. And we know that there were Jews in Ephesus. We went over this in Bible study episode 2. But also due to Paul's letters in Ephesians, in close proximity to the writing of this letter. And Gnosticism is an oftentimes neglected option for the antagonist, and we'll explore both of these. But looking at these attributes will definitely help us unveil the truth a little bit and figuring out who these people are. But it's important to look at the rest of the book to be able to decide this. But in review, we have a pretty interesting thing going on here. We have that these people are teaching contrary to Orthodox teaching, let's say. And they're giving themselves over to these myths, these falsehoods, and these endless genealogies. And this thing just promotes questions rather than God's plan. And the aim of our charge, Timothy, is pureness and love. And this comes from a good heart, conscience, and faith. And some of these people, by missing this mark, they've gone away and they've turned off into this just vain talk. And they want to be teachers. They don't know what they're talking about. And they don't even know what it means that they're making these insisting statements on. But we know that the law is good if one uses it in accordance with the law. For we know this, that the law is not laid down for the just, for the righteous, but for these wicked people and these things, these awful things. Anything that's contrary to this healthy doctrine and instruction that we're giving, which is in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. And then we'll see that Timothy has been entrusted too. So that is it for this episode. I pray this was, blessing for everyone. We got a little deep and everything, and I'm still getting acclimated to this whole podcast thing, and maybe that'll take some time. Tongue likes to get twisted on things, but it's all right. We do what the Lord wants us to do. But I'm excited for the rest of this. This is definitely a controversial epistle and book as a whole, but it'll be really cool to go over. And as I went over in the first episode, it's very relevant to our times. But we also need to step out of our times and get back into Paul's to be able to identify who these people are, what these things are. And I encourage you, when you're going along with this, just to look at what it says, review what we went over with. I'll be releasing a notes section to these, in time, just so everyone can kind of check back with with what I said and test the word and develop your own thoughts. But these are interesting terms. It's good to break down the Bible and the word, and especially letters and epistles like Paul's, and kind of see what's being said. So, pray you all have a blessed night, day, whenever you're listening to this, and shalom, shalom.